So this is something that honestly I could probably do an entire series on. For now, we're going to get into the 35, 40 minutes that John's been able to give me. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to put them up, and I'll try to get to them as they come in, but likely will be more towards the end. So, for many of you, I imagine that one of the big questions you're always asking yourself is, where do my variables go? If you've worked in Octopus for any length of time, you've probably had that moment of hesitation of not quite knowing where it goes. In Octopus, there are four core entities that relate to your variables. Those are environments, tenants, projects, and variable sets. And the relationship between these isn't always obvious. Like Octopus is flexible, it doesn't force strong opinions on you. And that flexibility is its strength, but also means you have to decide where things go. Like you have to have an opinion. Today, I'm going to try to give you a bit of a framework, a set of guidelines that I've worked with and worked well over the years. And by the end of it, you'll hopefully have a clear mental model for how this kind of works. Before we get I'm trying to figure that one. There we go. Yeah, so before we get to the solution, let's understand why this is confusing in the first place. And Octopus actually has two separate ways to scope variable values. The first, and I'm not sure how to zoom in, but is that one on the left, which is simple variable scopes. And John, if you're around, I don't actually how to jump to the screen. On my screen. Should have asked that first.
No, you're fine. You're fine. Let me go ahead and add the other screen there. There you
There we
go.
go. Yep.
Yeah, just let me know and I'll switch it for you.
Awesome. Thanks, mate. Yeah. So the first ones that you tend to have are these variable scopes. So really straightforward, really simple. You can jump in. You can decide how it works. You can base it off of environments, tags, processes. Um, you set the value and it applies when these conditions are met. The mental model here is like, here's a value, filter as these scopes apply. The second is tenant variables. This one's a little different. It's not about filtering, it's about filling in a matrix. For project variables especially, you need to provide a value, and we can show an example here. Just give it a test one. If you do it here, and I've got two tenants set up, you kind of have to provide a value for every tenant for every environment, which is intentional, but it's a different way of scoping for scoping your variables. And then you've also got common variables, which are the variables you can have across all tenants, but not relating to a project. So it means that, like, in project variables, even if you have the same variable, across 50 tenants, you still have to put it in 50 times. And if we go back to project variables here, you'll notice one thing that's kind of missing, and I believe it's a deliberate choice of Octopus, is there's no tenant option in here. You've got role, channel, process, but yeah, no tenant. You can get tenant specific values in here as we've discussed, but the way that you've got to do this, I lost my spot. Even if this project is only a consumer of something like a database string and things like that, it's hard to get it to have a tenant only one without going through the process of actually setting up a variable set or use an existing variable set and then putting it in the variables. And it works in the, geez, I'm losing my mind. Sorry, give me a sec. It works, but it forces you out of project variables. It puts you in a different area. You've got to go to tenant variables, or you've got to jump out, leave the project, come back in. Sorry, leave the project, go into variable sets, edit, come back in and make sure things are looking correct. And honestly, I think this confusion tends to be where this comes from. So when I've trained other people, this struggle of like, is it in a variable set? Is it in a project? Is it in tenant variables? Where do I put it? Has tended to be the course sticking point for most people. We can jump back to the slide if we want. There we go. Now, the framework. We'll jump into it and get a little bit started here. And the first guideline that I would have is always use tenants from the very beginning. Even if you only have one tenant today, just go and create a single one on there. We'll jump back to the thing. And I'll show you an example. Here are my tenants. Pretty straightforward. I've just given an example here. We've got company and company A. Pretty simple. Honestly, you could have this be called default. Go with the company name. Doesn't matter. Just something that's standard. Adding multi-tenancy later to the system that wasn't designed for it is incredibly painful. Trust me. The next thing that I tend to do, here we go, is add in a core configuration variable set. This is kind of a catch-all for all of your company's variables. Kind of like you have system variables that Octopus comes with. These are your company's system variables. It combines, at least the way that I've done it, the tenant identity and your naming standards. So first you can see in here, I tend to put, and this is just, by the way, this is not my actual company one. This is an example one I whipped up. But in here, you can see examples of tenant identity items. You've got things like key and your tenant account, domain suffixes, owners, just things that show up as the tenant's identity, anything that's about who the tenant is. You'll notice that a lot of these are prefixed. I'll go into that a little bit more shortly. But the other one, the other ones that I set up are things like your core naming standards and naming conventions. A few examples I threw in here are things like domains, resource names. So this is something we run all of ours in Azure. So I'll just say this is something, if you're running your stuff in Azure, this is a naming standard that we chose. And then I copied that for our Kubernetes release names and created a similar one here. I add other little fun keys like environment keys to make things just a little bit easier for when I want to use that in things like these names. We also tend to define a RACI for any one of our projects. And this shows up here as a nice little example for things that we can put into annotations on our K8s deployments as well. You'll notice here that these all have prefixes as well. These ones do core. Not necessary, but it makes it clear. When you're looking at in your project, and we'll look at it shortly, but when you're looking at a project and you can see the variable examples and you look through, it makes it really quick and easy to know where they're located and how to get access to it. The other ones that I then do, after I set up the core configuration variable set, and the next thing I tend to do is I'll actually create variable sets based off of the bounded context in whatever domain I'm working in. Your variable structure should and easily can mimic your architecture. So the other one that I'll do is this shared infrastructure. Now, this one may feel like a bit of a smell, but I've learned to treat it as a bit of a staging area prior to variables finding their home as well. But this holds variables for resources that exist across multiple bounded contexts, as well as, mostly just stuff across multiple bounded contexts, but the stuff that we also stage. These are things like, observability endpoints, your logging, your shared service buses, any sort of common database if you needed it, any common infrastructure that doesn't really need to be relative to any bounded context, you just keep it in there. I've given a good example of a database in here, a nice little open telemetry endpoint, and then something simple, a top-level domain. And then each bounded context in here has its own variable set. So if you have a payments domain, you have a payments variable set. If you have an orders domain, you have an orders variable set. In here, I've created an example for an accounts and a notifications. The beauty of this, and it depends on how skilled you are in it, is if you use infrastructure as code, you can actually use and we use a lot of Terraform, so we've got to use the Octopus provider. If you create a Terraform project that goes and sets up all of your infrastructure for your bounded context for this piece, it could be accounts notifications, you can actually have that set up and manage your variable set as well, and you don't need to worry about it. Similarly, if you use that infrastructure as code and you have tenants, by using this and making sure that you have tenants as a first class consideration, you can have all of these managed really nicely. Now, let me show you how this all comes together inside a project. In here, I've created a few different examples, and you'll notice that I tend to also group my projects based off of bounded context as well. That just keeps it nice and neat, nice and simple. Let me open up. Oop, here we go. Okay. Now, this project here includes like core configuration, shared infrastructure, and all the bounded contexts. If I grab the right one, actually, I'll go to the other one. I think I set that one up a little bit better. Here we go. There we go. Yeah. And we can kind of see how this all pops together. So if we jump in, and I'll show you the variable sets. Yep. So this has got the accounts bounded context, the core configuration, and the shared infrastructure. Keeps it nice and simple. Now, this is actually something I was so ecstatic when Octopus added this about, I want to say 6 months ago. And it makes things really nice, but it's also definitely going to make this presentation nice and easy. So before I jump into some of those things, I wanted to show you something which is maybe a bit shocking. Is I don't have anything in project templates, and here's the key insight that kind of simplifies everything, which is that if you have variable sets with your bounded context, a set for your shared infrastructure, and a set for the core configuration, I've actually found that I accidentally don't use tenant project variables anymore. It stays empty on pretty much every project. There are things here or there that we've ended up using it, but for the most part, yeah, I don't use this. Everything that would go here has a better home in one of the variable sets in either the bounded context. And honestly, this is huge because it kind of removes a big section of your decision tree. You're no longer choosing between project variables or tenant project variables or common variables or variable sets. It keeps it relatively simple because you're kind of thinking about this from the top down, really. Now, I want to go over some practical patterns here. So what does go into project variables? And honestly, not a lot either. The only things that I really ever put in here for me, now that I've done the other pieces, are things that are completely owned by a singular to this project. So values that this project creates and is only like the only consumer of, as well as values that matter only to this project, like project specific configuration. So environment variables unique to this service. So something you need. Variables that per project that are referenced in variable sets, and I'll show you that what I mean by that in a sec. One sec. Because in core configuration, as an example I showed there, is where you really define your naming conventions, and these templates then get referenced with ones we put at the project level. Things like you can see service type, service name, these are all defined here, and then they're consumed in those naming templates. So if anything else might consume it and you would have to change it in multiple projects, I tend not to put them here. I put them in project variables. Now the star there is, don't hesitate to lean on the rule of three either. As in, if you only have to manage it in 2 or 3 locations, yeah, it's fine. You can keep it there. You don't have to add the overhead. But any more than that, highly recommend you jump and put it into a variable set. Now, something I want to kind of cover here is a good example and something we lean on relatively heavily, we'll jump back into variable sets to do that. Are these naming conventions, or I call them composed variables? In here, what I've done is defined how all of our releases get named. Now, this is more Kubernetes, but it works regardless. Anything that requires you to define a name. In this example, this is the type of service, the name, where it's what environment it's in, and kind of where it's located or what it's for. It actually comes from a convention Microsoft defined, and it's why our resources are named in a similar pattern. You can see this one in here, almost identical. And then I've done a similar one, done a similar one here for subdomains. Now, that's not to say that you hard code this and this is how you would do it for every single project, but inside your core configuration, this is where you define your defaults, where people can lean on it and don't have to do it, don't have to worry about it. And you can do some cute things like this. I don't know if anyone or many people know about it, but this is actually like the default example that they'll show you how to do an if in the documentation, but basically just says that if it is defined, then add it in. And this gives us a lot of power because in my default subdomain, I've now made it that if you have a domain suffix defined, it'll add it, but if it doesn't, it keeps it nice and neat. And it just gives me a nice little, in my projects, when I put an ingress on the project, gives us a domain that I don't have to worry about it, and a consistent naming convention, which is what this is all about. You don't have to worry about it, it's in there. Similar actually is one of the reasons we added in this one, but we added as an annotation onto a lot of our K8s deployments so that if anyone's jumping in and looking around the resources, they don't have to leave out. But this would be a pain to do if you're doing it on every single project. But if you define these things from the beginning, you can kind of go do these, cute little things like this, and you don't have to worry about it. It just exists. And things like this domain suffix makes it nice and simple because you'll define them in your variables, and you'll make it usable, and you use it in each of your tenants. Now, side note, I don't know if anyone might have seen this, but this is a fun little thing you can do for anyone who actually wants to have common variables or tenant variables, but you need to have a blank value. The reason that exists is because if you have the default value blank on it, it'll actually ask you to specify you actually have to have a value. So just a fun little piece there. And then what does this all look like on a tenant? It jumps in. Apparently didn't get it all ready, but it jumps in, and you can go in and fill out all of these. So I do things like have the tenant key and just give it a unique little ID. You can set up your accounts, obviously. And you'll see here and this is my default tenant, you can have the suffix be blank. And then, things like tenant owners, location abbreviations, all these fun little things you can kind of set up. And there's a database in here. You can see the bounded context has its database set up. And then if we jump over to the other tenant, you can go get all of those worked out, plain and simple. And yeah, so different key, different owner, different set of notifications and accounts databases. Doesn't have to be though, like you could put in the same one if you wanted, or you could even use the default. It's up to you. Now, if we go and look at some of these other projects, you can see the way that these composed variables work. So where's my release name? I'm going, here we go. So you can see that it works nicely in here. Now I've defined the service type as a microservice. This is its name, this is its environment, and this is the tenant that it's for. Now, this is super powerful. And the reason is that when you go and add a new tenant, say you have a new integration partner that you're bringing on, you need to make sure that they have a stable environment to do. You don't have to worry about any sort of conflicts. You could spin it up in the exact same environment as the others, because you would just go and add in a new tenant, update those variables that we just showed, and change it. And automatically, without you having to change anything inside your project, it has a new release name. It could even have a new database. We would have seen this one change. Any of those pieces done, and that the power of that is all in making sure that you're using those composed variables. It keeps things really straightforward and really simple. You see things in here as well, like the racing did the same thing. And the reason for this is because the power of Octopus variables is that it also, because it's dynamic, it also doesn't enforce hierarchy. So, and it's actually infinitely recursive, which is awesome too. But you can set all of these things at all these different levels. So you can have variable sets that reference, as silly as it sounds, variables inside your project, because it won't blow up. It does this instead and just leaves it in there. It couldn't replace it, so it doesn't replace it. It keeps it nice and simple. But if you want to, you can change anything in here and you'll see that jump back in. Oh, I just had something pop up. I thought someone asked questions. Pardon me. So it's pretty straightforward. Now, I've kept it pretty simple with my examples here, but you can go pretty deep with it. You can keep it as simple as you want or as complicated as you want, but I've put some of the ones that we've got have a lot of smarts in it, very similar to these ifs, just to keep the complexity in one location, meaning that you don't have to put it in project after project after project, and it makes things straightforward. Because Octopus does all of the work for you. We're paying them to do the deployments. We might as well have them use all the power that they've got. Now, we'll jump back to the slide just because kill some time in that. But yeah, use variable sets to keep it nice and organized. Start off with a core configuration. Start off with getting a shared infrastructure, a place you can stage any of your common infrastructure that you may want to use, and where you put some of your variables ahead of time. And then one for each of your bounded contexts, things like accounts, notifications, reportings, orders, any of those ones. It keeps it simple. Now, to the decisions. How do you decide where the variables go? I really just ask myself two questions. What's responsible for creating the value, and what consumes the value? So if the same project creates it as well as is a consumer, then leave it in your project variables. And what I mean by that is, if inside your process, and none of these actually have a process, but if inside your process, you're spinning up a service bus, or you're spinning up a namespace, or I don't know, insert something here, maybe you've got some kind of, you can leave it in there because it's only going to be consumed by that one project. You can store that value in there. Now, sorry, I should say you won't spin up your infrastructure in a process. You'll do it in a runbook, of course, but same, but different. It goes in the project. If 2, 3, 4 projects are going to consume it, chances are it's probably already a bounded context, and you're better off looking to try to manage that inside a variable set. It makes it simpler when you have a new tenant. It makes it simpler when you have a new project. You don't have to copy paste, and a lot of the times it feels like you're doing a lot of work up front, but honestly, it saves you in the long run. And this is the way that I'm going to show you here, or the way that I've shown here. We've done this in 4, I want to say maybe 5 different companies that the crew that I hang out with has done with their startups. And every time we found that it's been helpful to start with tenants, start with variable sets, and manage it that way, because it means then that when we're rapidly prototyping and we're setting up a new project, it's not difficult to do so. Honestly, I'd love to show you one of our other repositories, other spaces, but in that one, whenever anyone has had to set up a new project, they'll just grab one of the other ones, clone, change which package it's pointing to, quickly edit the project variables that matter specifically to that project, and they're deploying in 5 minutes. It's really really straightforward. And that's about it. You don't have to worry too much about it. Now, the to wrap it up a little bit, and I'm kind of at the end here, I had the 40 minutes and I wanted to make sure I had 30 to give time for questions so I can ramble a bit more about other pieces afterwards. But I want to leave you guys with a few thoughts and talk about the mistakes I've kind of made often. Touched on to a few of them, but honestly, not creating those patterns in the variable values, those composable variables, it led to inconsistency and drift. As an organization, 9 times out of 10, you'll define how you want um, things to be named. Now, what I mean is you're not going to all sit around a room and design by committee with what it is. You'll just naturally gravitate towards a structure that you name. And it's better to make that concrete, put it in there, and then that way nobody has to worry about it because honestly, most engineers are lazy, and if they can have someone else do their pieces, they will. So be the person that does the paperwork and go define it, put it in the variable set, and everyone will keep using it. The other one is not using tenants early. That's not to say you can't have projects that aren't untenanted, but the default should be tenants. Create a company tenant, you don't lose out on anything, and use it in there. Then that way, because as everyone knows, with the way Octopus operates, everything's dynamic. You get to choose how it operates. So that means that if, as an engineer, you want to have, and I understand they've just added ephemeral environments, but if you wanted to start to have your own environment as an engineer, something that's ephemeral whenever you're doing your PRs, it's really straightforward for you to do so. You want to spin up your own CI environment, you can. You just go create it with your name, put all the details in, and instantly you're off to the races deploying for just you in there. And because of things like those composable variables, those naming conventions, especially if you put in the tenant key as part of it, you can deploy in the exact same namespace as your dev resources or your production ones because you won't get conflicts because you design your naming conventions to avoid those conflicts, to include things like a tenant and an environment. And if you wanted to live crazy, yeah, you could put all your environments in the same cluster as well. Depends how your infrastructure people want to operate. The other one is, yeah, not focusing on reuse. This kind of touches on that composed variables, variable sets. Just honestly, take the time. The longest path you'll ever take is the shortcut. So take the time, sit down, make sure that everything's in your variable sets, that you focused on that reuse. Things are easy. And that I've touched on a couple of times, but your deployment lifecycle should be boring. Even from setup, like especially from setup. Even if every project is a special little snowflake, which is actually where we got to, and we've worked hard over the last 6 months to avoid that. But if every project is a special snowflake with its own variable structure, own deployments, you'll spend more time debugging than you will be deploying, or worse, you'll be scared to deploy. You'll hesitate. You'll start moving into that company that'll deploy every 3 months instead of 3 times a day. Now, to recap a little bit, understand that there are two scoping systems and evaluate where the variables go based off of that. To be clear, that's not to say that one's better than the other. I've just tended to lean more into variable sets and scopes. It's simpler, easier, and fingers crossed, one day, hopefully, maybe Octopus will give me tenants as a scope in that area. Start with tenants from day one. Never hurts you. Takes 2 seconds to set it up. It's minor little pain every time you start up a project, but it'll, trust me, save you time in the long run. Create your core configuration variable set, put in your tenant identity, set up your naming standards, get those composable variables ready to go, and then mirror your architecture. Anything you do, even in small projects, are going to have some form of a bounded context. Set up variable sets related to them. Your life will be way easier. And then keep project variables tight and light. Only single owner, single consumer values. Really simple. And then when in doubt, just ask yourself, who created this variable and who consumes it? And that's it. Thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Awesome,
Thanks, Ian.
Dale. Thank you very much. That's great stuff. I was laughing off stage here because you're like, your deployments should be boring. I'm like, my deployments are exciting. Come on. What are you
Yeah,
talking about?
no,
I'm totally in agreement. Don't worry about it.
yeah.
We've got some questions here, but some of them are facetious. Obviously, Bill asking, so you're telling me that either global variables or no variables is bad advice. Thanks for that. And of course, Steve had a good chuckle about that.
Yeah.
One question that did come in here from Rob, he says, if you have the same variable name defined in multiple variable sets, and both variable sets are used by the same project, which value will be used?
Good question. Um, I actually think it won't let you, but the actually no, it will, and I've run into this. So let me see if I can get to the project where I'm at. Yep. So when you add the variable sets, it's ordered. I believe, and don't quote me on this, totally just go test it out. I believe it does it in the order that it appears in here. Now, this is ordered by name, but there is an order for how it gets added. There's an order for how it appears. And in one of those orders, it will choose which one it does. But
There you go.
that's where I would totally just set up an experiment, jump into variable preview and have a look. It could also be a flip of the coin. And I'm just saying that as an engineer and how sometimes I would implement something like this.
I think it comes down ultimately to, well, the resolution logic is based on basically there's a whole bunch of scopes that we also apply to variables as well. It depends on how those
Nice.
qualify. So there are things worth noting there. One other resource I did want to briefly mention here is we have a session by Matt here. This is Matt Alford, who's our developer advocate at Octopus. He did a recent video up on our YouTube channel called Variables in Octopus Deploy. So Matt does one of these videos every now and then. It's called Exploring Octopus Deploy, where he talks about what are variables, how they work, etc. Talks about scoping resolutions, etc. And so that's something that you can definitely check out there if you're so inclined. All right, take a look at some of the other questions here we might have for you there, Dale. I've got a question here. May I please have the recording of this session? And Tony jumps in here. Thank you, Tony. All recordings are going to be up on YouTube. They're going to probably show up in the next 24 hours. Hopefully less than that. But as the kids like to say, like and subscribe. And Tony was gracious enough to share with us the YouTube channel. There you go. Awesome. Rob did post a follow-up here. And would a variable defined in a project override a variable in a variable set added to that project if they have the same name?
Yes, they do, I believe. I don't know if you know for sure with the John, but I've done that before, and it'll override it. The one thing it won't do, which I wanted it to do a while ago, is if you set a variable set with a if you set a common variable and you don't define the value, it'll have you fill it out. You have to define it. Or if you set a variable where you have to request it when you do a deploy, where you need to fill it out, I thought I could do something like that and then have it override it locally inside the project and say, oh, here's like every project will then define that value. It won't let it, but the projects do override those variables. I've used that before.
There you go. Yeah, the documentation on this is pretty thorough. But you know
That's
what, Rob?
awesome.
Why don't you post this to the advice? I'm going to do a callback now. So we have our community Slack. Post this to the advice channel there, and hopefully you might get an answer in terms of the absolute. But if you don't, I'll make sure to cover it on a next edition of Support on Friday, which is a segment we have on Deploy on Friday, which is a show we have that we host every week. So there you go. Thanks for the questions, Rob. That's awesome. And then, of course, Tony here had to say the longest path you'll ever take is a shortcut. Awesome. Well, Dale, thank you very much for your presentation. Again, Dale's talking about variables there, so you'll check that out, obviously, on our YouTube channel after the fact. So thanks a lot for that. And Dale, thank you for your presentation. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, man. I enjoyed it.